The White House is under intense scrutiny tonight. President Trump has sparked widespread alarm by suggesting Republicans should effectively take control of elections in multiple states, comments that strike at the heart of America's decentralized voting system. At the same time, a fragile government funding agreement has just been signed into law, averting a deeper shutdown, but setting up a fierce two-week battle over immigration enforcement and oversight at the Department of Homeland Security. These developments are unfolding against a backdrop of rising tensions, tragic incidents involving federal agents, and fresh questions about the integrity and future of American democracy. This is Worldview. Good evening. I'm your host, bringing you the latest from Washington and around the country on the stories shaping our nation. Tonight, we examine the president's provocative statements on elections, the delicate negotiations ahead on Homeland Security funding, and the broader implications for governance, public trust, and the rule of law. Before we start, wherever you're watching or listening from, drop a comment, hit like, and subscribe to the channel. Today, we'll continue this conversation in the comments and respond to your questions. Tonight's report centers on a series of interconnected events that have placed the Trump administration at the center of two major controversies, one involving the fundamental structure of how Americans choose their leaders, and the other tied to the aggressive enforcement of immigration laws in communities across the country. Let's begin with the funding measure that recently cleared both chambers of Congress and reached the president's desk. After a brief but disruptive partial government shutdown, lawmakers managed to pass a large-scale appropriations package. This legislation provides full-year funding for most federal agencies, ensuring continuity for a wide range of government functions through the remainder of the fiscal year. However, it carves out an exception for the Department of Homeland Security. DHS received only a short-term extension, roughly 2 weeks of operating funds. This deliberate separation creates a narrow window for negotiations on additional conditions and reforms related to immigration operations. The path to this point was far from smooth. The House of Representatives approved the bill by a narrow margin, with a small number of Democrats crossing party lines to join the Republican majority. This cooperation was essential, given the razor-thin margins in play. President Trump had publicly urged lawmakers to pass the measure without amendments, emphasizing the need to restore normal government operations quickly. He has since signed the legislation, bringing an immediate end to the lapse in funding for affected agencies. This temporary resolution, however, merely postpones a more contentious fight. The coming days will focus intensely on DHS, particularly agencies like Immigration and Customs Enforcement, IC, and Customs and Border Protection. Democrats in Congress are pushing for significant changes to how these operations are conducted. They argue that recent enforcement actions have crossed lines, leading to unnecessary risks, community disruption, and, in tragic cases, loss of life. The urgency stems in part from events in Minnesota, specifically the Minneapolis area. The Trump administration deployed thousands of federal immigration officers there as part of a major enforcement surge. The operation aimed to identify and remove individuals in the country illegally, with a stated priority on those who have committed serious crimes. Yet the rollout has generated substantial backlash. Community leaders, local officials, and members of Congress have raised alarms about the tactics employed, the impact on families and neighborhoods, and reports of mistaken identities or overly aggressive encounters. Particularly disturbing were two fatal incidents involving U.S. citizens. In separate encounters, federal agents used lethal force, resulting in the deaths of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. These tragedies have fueled outrage and calls for greater accountability. Relatives of the victims have spoken publicly, describing the profound and lasting pain inflicted on families. One family member poignantly explained the challenge of helping a young child process the fear and confusion when passing by federal officers in the community. Encounters that once felt distant now feel immediate and threatening. In direct response to these concerns, and amid growing pressure from lawmakers and the public, DHS Secretary Kristi Noem announced a significant policy shift. Effective immediately, all federal immigration officers operating in Minneapolis must wear body cameras during field activities. The secretary described this as a step toward greater transparency for the public and improved safety for officers. She noted a sharp rise in threats directed at federal personnel, suggesting that video documentation could protect agents from false accusations while allowing independent review of interactions. The body camera requirement has been welcomed by many as a common sense measure. Supporters point out that such technology has become standard in many local law enforcement agencies, providing objective records that can clarify what occurred during high-stress situations. At the same time, critics argue that cameras alone do not address deeper issues, such as the specific tactics used in operations, decisions about when force is necessary, or policies around facial coverings during raids. The announcement also leaves open questions about nationwide implementation, with the Secretary indicating expansion would depend on available funding and resources. From the White House perspective, administration officials have stressed their commitment to enforcing existing immigration statutes. A senior spokesperson emphasized that the president intends to fulfill what he describes as a clear mandate from voters to prioritize public safety by removing individuals who pose criminal threats. They have signaled openness to dialogue, but have drawn a firm line against any concessions that would weaken enforcement efforts. This sets the stage for the upcoming negotiations. Congressional Democrats, led by figures in both the House and Senate, are preparing a package of proposed reforms. These could include mandatory requirements for body camera usage, restrictions on certain operational practices, and greater oversight mechanisms. Some moderate voices have indicated they will not support continued DHS funding without statutory changes that codify accountability measures. Republican leaders, meanwhile, have expressed hope for good faith talks, but have also urged state and local officials in Democratic-led areas to cooperate more fully with federal immigration authorities. The funding dynamic reveals broader philosophical divides. Republicans generally view robust immigration enforcement as essential to national security and the rule of law. Many argue that sanctuary policies in certain cities hinder federal efforts and endanger communities. Democrats counter that aggressive interior enforcement disrupts families, diverts resources from serious threats, and risks eroding public trust in government institutions. Adding another layer of complexity to the current landscape are the president's recent remarks about the American election system itself. In an interview on a podcast hosted by Dan Bongino, a former deputy FBI director, President Trump suggested that Republicans should work to take over and nationalize voting procedures, specifically mentioning the need for federal involvement in at least 15 locations or states that he characterized as problematic. These statements immediately drew sharp reactions. The U.S. Constitution is explicit on this point. Article 1 assigns to state legislatures the primary authority to determine the times, places, and manner of holding elections for federal offices. This decentralized approach has long been seen as a safeguard, allowing local officials, often neighbors and community members, to administer the process and build confidence in its fairness. Republican congressional leaders responded cautiously but firmly. The House Speaker described federalizing elections as raising serious constitutional questions. The Senate Majority Leader echoed that sentiment, noting that states have historically managed elections effectively when they prioritize integrity. Both emphasized concerns about election practices in certain Democratic-leaning jurisdictions, but stopped short of endorsing any shift toward centralized federal control. Democrats were far more direct in their criticism, labeling the comments as dangerous and autocratic. Several expressed deep worry that such rhetoric undermines public faith in democratic institutions and could foreshadow attempts to alter the rules ahead of upcoming midterm elections and beyond. The White House moved quickly to offer clarification. The press secretary explained that the president was referring to support for pending legislation, commonly known as the SAVE Act, that would require documentary proof of citizenship for voter registration in federal elections. She described it as a straightforward, common-sense reform that Republicans have long championed. Yet the president's phrasing, specifically referencing 15 places where intervention might be needed, has left observers puzzled, since any federal statute would apply uniformly nationwide rather than selectively. This discrepancy has fueled ongoing debate about the precise intent behind the remarks. This is not the first time the president has questioned aspects of the electoral process. He has repeatedly raised unsubstantiated claims about irregularities in past contests, including the 2020 election. Recent events, such as an FBI search warrant executed at an elections facility in Fulton County, Georgia, where agents collected records and materials related to the 2020 vote, have intensified scrutiny. The raid, conducted under a judicially approved warrant, has prompted legal challenges from local officials seeking the return of seized items. It has also sparked broader discussion about the role of federal agencies in reviewing historical election materials and whether such actions could influence perceptions of upcoming contests. Critics warn that revisiting settled outcomes from years ago risks diverting attention from current safeguards and preparations. Supporters of the administration's approach argue that thorough investigations are necessary to restore confidence where doubts persist. These overlapping controversies, immigration enforcement, funding battles, and election-related statements, illustrate the high-stakes environment in Washington. Each carries implications for public safety, institutional trust, and the balance of power between federal and state authorities. As the 2-week DHS funding window begins, negotiators face the challenge of bridging deep differences while avoiding another lapse that could disrupt essential services. At the same time, the president's comments on elections continue to reverberate, prompting reflection on the safeguards that protect the democratic process. We will, of course, monitor developments closely. The decisions made in the coming days could shape not only immediate government operations, but also the longer-term trajectory of American governance. Thank you for joining us on Worldview. We invite your thoughts below. What questions do you have about these unfolding stories? We'll be reading and responding. Good morning,